a fantastic speaker today. Suki is a lecturer in philosophy and gender studies at Royal Holloway University. She's worked also at the University of Southampton on better understanding the metaphysics of pregnancy and has held visiting fellowships in Oslo, Vienna, Australian National University, New York University, and City, New York Graduate Centre. So well-travelled, well-studied, author of What's in a Donut Hole and other philosophical food for thought, a fun, accessible book. Editor of Women of Ideas, on the Executive Committee for the Society of Women in Philosophy, and the Council of our sainted sponsors and supporters, the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Thank you, Robin. Also a musician. So do have a look at Suki's website, sukifilm.com, if you would like to hear more about any of those other areas that Suki studies and talks about. Today we're going to be talking about one of Suki's specialist subjects, the philosophy of pregnancy, and particularly today how it does create, I suppose, not only a child but a parent, and how English and Welsh law defines and genders that parent as a mother. But we're going to be talking about how different parents identify cases of surrogacy and adoption, and what makes a mother fundamentally. And we're going to find out how pregnancy is not necessary or sufficient to answer that question. Is that right, Suki?
That's right.
Excellent. So thank you very much for joining us, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction and for the invitation. It's really great to be here and to see so many of you here today in the audience. Thanks for coming, and thanks to those watching online as well. So yes, today I'm going to be talking about the philosophy of pregnancy. And before I get into some actual theoretical work, I'm going to take you on a journey as to how I came to philosophize about pregnancy, given that we often think of philosophy as being much more of an abstract engagement with reality, and some of the ways that I've applied those skills in that work. So firstly, when I did my PhD, I did it in a very, very technical, abstract world of metaphysics, and the thesis that I produced was so wacky that it got memed. This is the meme that became of my PhD thesis, just the philosophy football bros kind of egging it on each time the chapters got more and more progressively complex and obscure. And that wasn't really the vibe that I was hoping for with my philosophy. So, and things didn't get much better directly after my PhD when I coined a word, metaphysics, in a paper that I published. And that similarly got memed with increasing levels of obscurity, as you can see here. And so after that, I really wanted to change direction and produce work that didn't get the incredulous stare, as it is known, and rather engaged with the world in a way that meant something meaningful and not induced these sorts of facial expressions. So hopefully that's what I'm going to provide you with tonight, something that seems meaningful and impactful as opposed to obscure and strange. Okay, so things changed for me when I was asked at a Society for Women in Philosophy conference whether all philosophers who are feminists should do feminist philosophy. This question at the time really got me thinking. At the time I was working in metaphysics and logic and doing all this abstract stuff. But I also identified as a feminist and sort of wore my feminist hat proudly. And so when I was presented with this question, my initial response was, no, I can do whatever I like, power to the gender that I am, and I can do the sort of metaphysics if I want, just like the philosophy bros can as well. So as a feminist, as a philosopher, I don't need to do feminist philosophy. But since then, I actually have changed my position on this, and I feel that just as quite generally all people ought to be feminists of some kind, then all philosophers ought to do their philosophy in some feminist way, have some feminist approach to philosophizing. So my knee-jerk reaction of thinking, no, I'm going to stick to my metaphysics has really changed. And now the topics that I approach in philosophy, I approach them with a feminist stance. And as was mentioned in my introduction, I had a bumpy start in that I was a postdoc on a project where BUMP was the acronym for Better Understanding the Metaphysics of Pregnancy. It's a great acronym for the project that was run by Elsa Kinma. And so that is where I started applying the skills, the tools, the type of thinking that I had developed as someone that did metaphysics to the case of pregnancy, to this real world case, and not some crazy brain in a vat style experiment that you might have heard or been utilised in philosophy previously. So that's how I got to that. And now I'm going to talk about the work that I've done in the philosophy of pregnancy. I started off asking and trying to answer this question: what is the metaphysical relationship between the fetus and the gestator, as in the person who is pregnant? How can we understand that relationship beyond what, say, biology tells us? And I was trying to articulate a concept of gestation that was in contrast to the cultural prevailing model of having buns in the oven. You may have heard that colloquialism that to be pregnant is to have buns in the oven. And that, to me, really implies a containment style relationship between the fetus and the gestator, where there's really not much more intertwinement than just having them being baked inside a container that go in and come out easy peasy. And so I wrote about some different options in these places here. In contrast to this containment model, I thought about a parthood model where there's a mereological, which is a metaphysical understanding of parts relationships between the fetus and the gestator. So the fetus could be seen as a part of the person that is gestating them, and a part that then becomes detached, if you like, after birth. I also thought about overlap models where there's some shared matter between the fetus and the gestator. For example, you might think the placenta or the umbilical cord are good candidates for where there's something shared between these two otherwise individualized entities. And then there's this other idea that I thought about of underlap, which takes a mereological sum of the fetus and the person who is pregnant, and together they create what is the state of pregnancy. So why was I thinking about these options? Well, like I said, it was to challenge a dominant cultural model, which I thought was actually quite a dangerous model in how it can be utilised for decreasing pregnant people's rights and autonomy over their body, if they're seen as simply containers for what they're gestating. And so I was really thinking bioethically about the impact and applications that these models might have. I thought further about how they might impact on the different assisted reproductive technologies that get developed, and how those technologies are even understood. Because according to different models, different ways of reproducing look quite distinct. I'll talk through a couple of cases. So I'll talk through surrogacy. So if we think about surrogacy utilising the bun in the oven style model, then the surrogate arrangement looks like the person who is providing gestation is just allowing a use of their womb as a space and providing that service of gestation. If we think of surrogacy, however, with the parthood model, then what the surrogate is providing is a part of their body. It almost becomes like adoption of a body part at birth, because what is being contributed from the surrogate parent is a product of their body, a part of their body. So surrogacy looks very different on these two conceptions of pregnancy. And then another example that I've thought about is when gestation is even further outsourced, not from it to a surrogate, but to a machine. And so here we see the rise of the artificial womb, for example, which is already in development and has had some successful fetal lambs be gestated in artificial environments. If we think of pregnancy and gestation as just a parthood relationship, then we can understand some of those technologies as actually where the neonate is merely incubating within an environment, simply inside the environment, without being a part of that environment. But then there are other technologies which don't really fit that incubation model, which Elsaline Kingma and I have developed a new terminology which we think is more apt. It's called APT, which is artificial amnion and placental technology. And within those technologies, here's a picture of the lamb that I was describing. What we have is the lamb, the fetal lamb, and all of the rest of its surrounds as being parts of each other, and such that it's not just an environment or a container that is being provided. So we distinguish between different technologies that are being developed with respect to whether they are merely incubating and containing a neonate, or whether they are gestating in a parthood reciprocal relationship with the artificial amnion and placenta. And we call that ectogestation in that second example. So if these different conceptions, for want of a better word, conceptions of pregnancy make a difference to how we think about assisted reproductive technologies and the policies that surround them and the developments of them, we better have a think about which conception or model of pregnancy is true, is the right one, is the one that we should go for, given that they make such a difference. To which I faced this kind of meta-philosophical issue of how to adjudicate between them. How would I be able to decide? How would one be able to decide which model best represents pregnancy that we should then try to model our technologies on in order to replicate pregnancy? And for this, I then went beyond philosophy, and I think that is necessary for, I think, any question that one might ask. We have to think kind of interdisciplinarily. Reality isn't divided up by disciplines such that one discipline can have all and only the answers about one topic. So I think an interdisciplinary effort is required. And to exercise this method of reflective equilibrium between those disciplines, where we try to balance and go back and forth between alternative perspectives, and to, importantly, with a feminist approach, I want this to be values-led, that if something turns out to be particularly immoral, then that ought not be the thing that we go for. So I have a values-led approach, importantly, which also led me to question how much philosophy could contribute, because when we think about the underrepresentation in philosophy of women and people who could have otherwise been involved in pregnancy, we see that philosophy has been quite androcentric, and as a result might not have the right sorts of toolkit to be applied to questions about pregnancy. It might not be that well suited. And so I've written about those sorts of metaphilosophical worries there. Relatedly, thinking about how we can utilize the toolkit of philosophy for situations that it was never really designed for. Can we co-opt theory within philosophy and methods within philosophy to serve feminist aims and to better understand pregnancy and other gendered experiences? To which I refer to Audre Lorde, who said in a very influential speech that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So there's a limit to what your toolkit can do, given what it was initially designed for. And if it was designed to uphold certain structures, it's not going to do that well in trying to formulate something better. And then when thinking about this with respect to assisted reproductive technologies, are those technologies themselves tools for gender liberation? Why were these technologies developed? What are they designed for? Can they too be co-opted for the purposes of furthering feminist aims? Are they putting fetus first, or are they putting gestator first? Because oftentimes there is the literature makes a demarcation between these. And so I've asked, who are these assisted reproductive technologies liberatory for? It might be that they are in aid of some people at the expense of others, and that it therefore emphasises an individual choice, the autonomy to be able to choose how you navigate pregnancy, whether you navigate pregnancy, over and above having structural changes that might make society a better place to be pregnant overall for everyone. Also, these assisted reproductive technologies, if they are to claim, as some famous people like Shulamit Firestone has claimed, would be able to further the aims of feminism, they do so by eliminating a sex difference. But this to me seems kind of depressing, that our way towards eliminating sexism is to eliminate sex difference, because I think that misdiagnoses what the problem is. If we notice a difference between sexes or genders, it's not that those differences in and of themselves are problematic. It's the value judgments and the hierarchies that we then place on those differences that creates sexism. And so whilst we might want to just utilize technologies to eliminate the difference between who gets to gestate and who doesn't, that doesn't tackle the underlying sexism in society. It just plasters it over in a way. And it creates a kind of technological fix that would otherwise naturalize and essentialize what I consider to be a social problem. So related to that, that's how I've come to think about trans feminism, as in feminism that is trans inclusive. I've thought about how social situations impact on what pregnancy is like, given that I think that we ought to look for social answers to social problems. What are then the social problems that come up with respect to reproduction? Well, reproduction isn't the same for each person that experiences it. I know that's fairly obvious. But for example, there's a huge stratification of outcomes for pregnant people that can be traced along racialization, along transgender history, economic status, and so on. And So given that pregnancy is different for these people depending on those different social positionings, technology isn't going to fix that and neutralize those differences. It's actually just going to hide them and further embed them. And when we think about who's even making use of these technologies, there's a difference in which social groups benefit from them and which are suffering as a result, and the outcomes of pregnancy also distinguished along those lines. Yet there's some strands of the literature which say that trans reproduction and its use, the use of trans people's use of technologies can show that there's nothing gendered and nothing sexed about pregnancy. And so if part of our feminist aim is to have a less gendered understanding of pregnancy, then trans people are very well positioned to demonstrate that. And technology also is well positioned to demonstrate that. And so what's then to become of our sex and gendered concepts if we are able to see that they can be pulled apart in this way? Well, I think that what is required is some conceptual analysis and conceptual engineering in the social domain, in the medical domain, in the legal domain. And what I'm going to do in the remainder of this talk is some of that conceptual analysis and engineering, which I have called, rather than better understanding the metaphysics of pregnancy, it's rather than, I'll just repeat that because the mic went out. Rather than better understanding the metaphysics of pregnancy, I want to be transforming what pregnancy can be conceptualized as. So not just a descriptive project, but a prescriptive, more normative project as well. So I work with people that are trans and pregnant. For example, this is Freddie McConnell, who you actually might notice had a very high profile legal battle here in England, in the UK, with regards to their pregnancy and their parenting status. But we can come to that in a moment. So like Freddie, some trans men choose to renounce or postpone their hormonal therapies or surgeries in order to maintain the physiological capabilities to become pregnant. Yet, in being pregnant and then giving birth, don't identify as mothers for gendered reasons. They identify as a father or a non-binary term. And in doing so, in undergoing this experience, which is otherwise so closely related to motherhood, we see a kind of tension within, or a contradiction with, our inherited assumptions, and this impacts on our understandings of gendered and embodied identities and the surrounding medical and legal apparatus. And I'm going to try and highlight some of the philosophical underpinnings of that apparatus. In particular, I want to highlight that there's a biological essentialism of how we define a mother that permeates legal and medical policy, and how that is in a kind of influencing position, in a circular influencing position with how we in society also understand motherhood. So what do I mean by biological essentialism? A biological essentialist definition of mother would take birth giving, i.e. having given birth, as being a necessary and sufficient condition for what it means to be a mother. I'll go through each of those in turn. If we take birth giving as sufficient for motherhood, that means that if you are the birth giver, then you are the mother. If you've given birth, you're considered the mother. That's what it means for birth giving to be sufficient for it. That entails that everyone who's given birth is thereby a mother. There can be no birth givers, no people who have given birth that aren't then considered mothers. That's what the sufficiency condition holds. On the other hand, where the direction of entailment goes the other way, considering birth giving as necessary for motherhood means that if you are the mother, then you are the birth giver. That entails that all mothers are birth givers, and there are no mothers who are not birth givers. Put these two directions together and you get a definition. Sometimes in philosophy we try to aim for definitions through finding necessary and sufficient conditions. And if we take birth giving as being both necessary and sufficient for an understanding or definition of motherhood, then you are a mother if and only if you are a birth giver. And mother and person who gives birth become coextensional. They refer to all and only the same people. They have the same meaning. There is no distinguishing between them. You can't get one without the other. And so when I'm analysing how there's a biologically essentialist understanding of motherhood in legal and medical practice, I mean that there's not a distinction between birth giving and motherhood in those arenas. So let me evidence that for now for you. So the sufficiency condition. So in the UK and also elsewhere, giving birth always results in the creation of a legal mother. And this is a result of I think a Roman principle that I don't know if I'm going to embarrass myself by trying to read that, the mater semper certa est principle. So that directly translates as the mother is always certain. And I presume that this came about, this principle, because you can't be certain who provided the sperm, but it's kind of obvious who's giving birth. And so they came up with this principle that the mother, at least, is certain, because they postulated that the mother is the person giving birth. And that has had significant impact on how motherhood is legislated. Because now in English and Welsh law, it's not possible for there to be a birth without there being a mother, without there being the construction of a legal subject that is the mother. Whoever gives birth is automatically registered as a mother on a birth certificate. And there's some citations for where that's documented. But of course, hopefully, as you might guess from my introduction on trans feminism, the mother is not actually always certain from birth giving. All we can be sure of is the person giving birth is the person giving birth. But to then label them as a mother for engendered or social, in other social meanings, is a step too far that we can't always take. But the birth giver is always the mother in English and Welsh law for at least 6 weeks, 6 weeks minimum. After that, motherhood can be relinquished, for example, in the cases of giving effective consent to adoption or some other parental order. So legal mother can kind of be taken off your hands, but only after 6 weeks. So that shows that birth giving is sufficient to make someone a mother. And here's evidencing necessity. Even once one of those parental orders are granted to an intended mother or parent, and the birth giver's status as legal mother has been extinguished, note that that intended mother, if they're a woman, is only vested with legal parenthood. They'll be registered as parent. They won't be legally recognised as mother. There's only one way to get recognised as a legal mother, and that's through giving birth. So there are many family arrangements, not just with trans parents, but many family arrangements whereby someone else might wish to be understood legally as a mother. There might be lesbian parents where one or even both weren't the birth givers, but they are to be considered the mother or the mothers. And in adoption, in surrogacy, in all of these cases, the person who wants to be understood as the legal mother cannot be, because they do not meet the necessity condition of having given birth. So regardless of any genetic relation to the offspring via an egg transfer, for example, regardless of the intended parent being a woman and identifying as a mother, they will not be legally understood as mother. They might get elsewhere this kind of qualified adoptive mother, but that's as much as can be granted. So this demonstrates that if you don't meet the necessary condition of giving birth, you won't be deemed an unqualified, if you know what I mean, unqualified legal mother, because that's only established through giving birth. I think this fails to understand and recognise and reflect the different family forms that we see in society, because we can conceive and understand, and there exists many mothers who did not give birth, and so that challenges that necessity condition, but that's blocked by just being called a parent. We also can understand that there are people that have given birth that do not wish to be mothers, and that challenges that sufficiency condition, but of course is blocked for that 6 weeks minimum. And so in contrast to that, I think being a mother and being pregnant are actually multiply realizable states. There are multiple ways of becoming a mother, multiple ways of becoming pregnant that don't entail each other and do not require each other. So they come apart. For example, there are mothers without pregnancy, like mothers who are adopting their children, trans mothers who weren't pregnant, lesbian mothers who didn't go through the pregnancy, godmothers, and all sorts. And same that we can also understand that there's often cases of pregnancy that doesn't lead to there also being a mother. Again, when in the cases of adoption, where you've given birth and then your child is adopted by someone else, in surrogacy, with miscarriage, with anonymous birthing, as is practiced, there's legal situation in France of anonymous birthing, and then the cases that I'm most interested here with pregnant, trans and non-binary people, where the term mother misgenders them. So they've given birth, they were pregnant, but they don't identify as mothers because they don't identify as women. What's to be done then? I'm going to go through a couple of strategies, I suppose, for re-engineering this concept of motherhood that can be inclusive of all of these different types of mothers and all these different ways of being pregnant. I'm going to go through a degendering strategy and a desexing strategy. As a spoiler alert, I don't think either of them work, but I'll explain why as we go through. So on a degendering strategy, we could see potentially that mother, we could postulate that mother is only a sexed term. It only means being a birth giver. And if we strip it of its gender, then it can include all gendered people who have gone through this sexed biological experience. So on this strategy, it retains the necessity condition that there will be no mothers who are not birth givers, which I think is a problem. A way of trying to justify this sort of approach is to say that all that gender is sex. And so all of these gendered terms can be reduced down to their sexed meaning. So as a result, these terms like mother can just be used across the board, apart from they have to specify a specific sex. So mother just means anyone who gives birth, who's gone through that biological process, and woman means anyone who is female. So stripping these terms of their gendered implications. As a result, gender neutral language would become kind of unnecessary if gender is taken to be itself neutral, or rather just empty, meaning only and nothing above its biological sexed meaning. So, for example, moving from breastfeeding to language like chest feeding is not required when the word breast is already free of any gendered implications and just means some certain biological tissue. What this would mean for the pregnant trans man is that they would be re-identified as a mother, because mother would just mean that they had gone through pregnancy. And furthermore, they wouldn't be understood as a man at all, because man just tracks a sexed meaning, and woman therefore would be more appropriate for that biological state. And the argument, I suppose, goes, well, you can't misgender someone if there's no such thing as gender. I think this is a really bad strategy. I think it completely misses the point that these terms are gendered. We can't pretend that they're not and hope that they're not in certain domains, and try to invisibilize the differences that gender makes, which sex doesn't capture. So I think the degendering motherhood strategy fails to be inclusive of different ways of being pregnant and becoming a parent, because it misses out gendered reality, and it misgenders people, which is morally contestable in and of itself. So moving on then to a desexing strategy. Instead of thinking that mother is somehow not got any gendered meaning, rather on the desexing strategy, mother wouldn't have a biological meaning, and instead it can be queered in the sense of the verb of doing something to motherhood that allows it to be more inclusive of different forms of motherhood. So the process of queering motherhood starts by desexing and denaturalizing motherhood. So there's no natural body or specifically sexed body that a mother must have, and mother can then just refer to anyone that takes on a role that motherhood would otherwise encapsulate. So at least this breaks the necessity link between birth giving and motherhood, such that giving birth is no longer a necessary condition, and so it's not essential to be deemed as a mother, and thereby can understand all sorts of mothers as mothers, even if they haven't given birth. But unfortunately, it still maintains the sufficiency of giving birth for motherhood in some understandings of it, because whilst even though there are other ways to motherhood, different multiply realizable ways of becoming a mother, it still holds on to the idea that giving birth is one of those ways, and indeed it directly takes you to motherhood. It's sufficient for motherhood if you've given birth. Another issue for this strategy is that whilst it might be the case that some trans pregnant men are comfortable with being termed a queer mother, in that they've queered motherhood through their process of being a trans or non-binary person, engaging in otherwise motherhood practices like being pregnant and giving birth, it doesn't necessarily mean that all trans and non-binary people who queer motherhood end up identifying as a queer mother in the noun sense. So queering something doesn't always result in a queer subject in the noun sense. So trans men who give birth, they may indeed queer motherhood, but they might not be queer mothers. So this desexing strategy still doesn't do what it needs to do in order to understand the multiplicity of ways that people become mothers or fathers or non-binary parents. Okay, my time is nearly up, so I'm going to conclude now. Hopefully, what I've demonstrated is that there are plenty of philosophical issues that can be explored regarding pregnancy. And I hope that that's been a little bit illuminating, because it might be the case that you hadn't paired philosophy with pregnancy before. I've tried to outline that doing so in a feminist fashion requires at least a critical engagement with the toolkits and the methodologies that are being used, and ensuring that our theories, our philosophical theories and otherwise, are held up against the tribunal of diverse experiences. They can't only fit a certain subsection of the population. If they don't fit for other parts of the population, then there's something wrong with those theories. And this is important because our theories have ethical implications and can impact on policy, they can impact on law, they can impact on developments of new technologies. I've evidenced one of those impacts with respect to the biological essentialism that underpins English and Welsh law, that defines birth giving as being both necessary and sufficient for motherhood. And so trans pregnancies are aptly positioned to prove the error of that style of biological essentialism. But I don't think that we should only be thinking about what trans pregnancy does for our theories. We also really need to focus on how these theories in academia and elsewhere are failing trans and non-binary people in practice. So we need to do something better for that population. And I think doing better requires something different to degendering and desexing motherhood, which have been the strategies that I've seen utilised. And I think that they don't work for the reasons that I provided. And I think in order for a strategy to work, it has to break both the necessary insufficiency conditions of birth giving, not just one or the other, which those degendering and desexing motherhood strategies do. So thank you so much for your attention. Here's all the references if you're interested to follow up on some of my work. Thank you.